My father left me his house and his will until my stepmother produced a new will with my name scratched out. I spent nights finding proof. My dad called me 2 weeks before he died and said something simple. The house was mine. He said it like it was settled. No drama, no lecture. He sounded tired but happy with his choice. 2 days after the funeral, my stepmother slid a lawyer's envelope across the table and said there had been a change. My name was gone from the will. Her name was there instead. My stomach dropped so hard I couldn't breathe. I asked to see the document. She smiled and handed me a clean, notarized copy filed at the probate office. The original will that named me was, she said, outdated. She'd been named executor. She'd followed the law. My phone buzzed in my pocket with messages from cousins saying I should let it go to spare, family drama. My aunt texted that contests were messy and expensive. My mother said maybe my dad changed his mind. Everyone who'd loved my father suddenly had reasons to accept the new will. I could not accept it. I knew my father. He had said my name. He had written notes about the house on sticky notes stuck to the kitchen cabinet for years. Those stickies mentioned me by name. None of that matched the neat words on the notarized page. That night I drove to the probate office and sat under the fluorescent lights until they closed. I watched as the clerk slid the filed will across the counter, and I studied the case number, the filing date, the notary stamp. The filing date was 10 days after my father had been buried. The stamp looked crisp. The signature on the notary line matched the handwriting on a stack of other filings I found in the county database. I took photos with my phone and left shaking. I started pulling everything I could find. Deeds, tax records, any papers with my father's signature. A week later, I found a photocopy of the will he'd given me years earlier during a family dinner where he'd said he wanted the house to stay in the family. The page was dog-eared, and it had his handwriting in the margin saying my name. I compared the photocopy to the new will. Different paperweight, different ink. The signature on the photocopy had a shaky tail my father always did. The signature on the notarized will looked practiced and rounded, almost too clean. 2 nights in a row, I sat at my kitchen table with highlighters and a magnifying glass, staring at lines and letter shapes until they blurred. I printed everything twice. I traced signatures with my finger. I told myself to breathe. Then I found an email my father had sent me 3 months earlier. He had attached a scanned copy of his original will and an old photo of us on the porch. He'd written he wanted me to have the house. The timestamp on the email was a fact the notarized will could not explain away. For 2 days, I felt like I was holding the only real thing in a house of lies. I printed the email. I made photocopies. I sent screenshots to friends for safekeeping. I told one friend not to tell my parents. I knew what I had could be the difference between a court victory and giving up everything. When I asked the lawyer who filed the new will why the date on their copy didn't match my father's last email, the lawyer said my father had updated his wishes later. I pushed and he pushed back, citing witnesses, dates, and the notary's certification. He smiled politely and told me the courts preferred clean documents with witnesses and current dates. That night, I drove to the house and sat on the curb across the street until dawn. My father had lived in that house for 30 years. I knew where he kept junk mail and which floorboard creaked. I kept replaying his voice saying the house was mine. Things started getting worse when I noticed the lock to his office was new. I'd been in that office dozens of times. The old brass key fit the old lock. The new lock meant someone had changed it recently, someone who had access and time to do it. I called the bank the next morning and asked about safe deposit boxes. The teller told me there was one box my father had rented here and it had been emptied the week after his death. They could not release the contents to me without the executor's authorization. I drove straight to the bank. I argued. I demanded to see what had been removed. The bank manager was polite and said their hands were tied. The box had been opened by the executor with 2 witnesses present, he said. One of the witnesses was my stepmother. My hands shook as I left the bank. The box had likely held the original will. Someone had cleared it out before I even knew the funeral was over. I kept thinking about the timing and the new notary stamp. The coincidence felt too loud. I started waking at night and searching. I looked in my father's attic for anything with his handwriting. I dug through old file boxes in the garage. I drove to the dumpster behind the nursing home where my father had dropped off old papers and dug with bare hands through soggy receipts and shredded mail. On the second night, digging through trash, I found a corner of paper with an old staple and the start of a line that matched the will his email had attached. It wasn't the whole page, but it had a date and part of his signature. It looked like someone had tried to destroy what tied him to his earlier wishes. I took photos of the corner and sent them to an attorney I found online who handled will contests. He called me that night and said the shred looked like intentional disposal. He said not to touch anything else and to let him file a motion to preserve evidence. The motion moved fast because the judge could see the urgency. The probate clerk put a temporary hold on the estate while the court reviewed the competing documents. For the first time since the funeral, I felt a sliver of hope. Then my mother cried and told me I had started a war. She said stepmother had given up a good life to care for my father and had the right to be protected. She called it honorable. She asked me to consider the pain this would cause. She kept saying family and respect. My aunt called and said the media would love a fight, and the family didn't need more headlines. My cousins texted me that they'd rather not be dragged into depositions. My dad's nurse told me that my father had been confused at the end and that wishes changed. Enough people said enough things to make my step feel like I was pushing against a tide. Everything blew up the night my stepmother filed a countersuit asking the court to deny any of my claims and to move forward with the new will. She attached affidavits from 2 neighbors who said they'd seen my father signing the new will. The affidavits were typed and notarized. I took the affidavits to my attorney, and he said something I didn't want to hear. If the witnesses truly believed they watched the signing, The court would weigh their testimony heavily unless we had stronger proof. He said the email and the photocopied will were helpful but not conclusive proof of fraud. I stopped sleeping. I opened the old email again and again, checking headers and timestamps. I printed bank statements. I traced every visit my stepmother had logged at my father's house. I made lists of every person who could have seen my father in the months before he died. Then I found a name in the margins of my father's calendar. Not a name, but a phone number scrawled in pencil with a sticky note attached that said Notary 2's 3 p.m. The date matched the day before the will was filed. I asked my father's hospice aide about that day, and she remembered a woman in a navy coat coming in and speaking with my stepmother in hushed tones. She remembered the notary being there later that afternoon. I subpoenaed the notary's appointment book. The notary's office sent a copy and a signed log showing the clients that day. The log had a name that could be my father's, but the ID number on the form was blank. The notary's signature looked rushed. That was when things started getting dangerous. I got a voicemail on my phone from an unknown number saying I should drop the case, or someone would make sure it cost me everything. The message was short and higher in pitch than my stepmother's voice. I saved it and gave it to my attorney and the police. The police opened a file. They told me threats didn't automatically mean a crime had been committed, but they took the voicemail and promised to look into it. The stepmother called to say she had also received threats and she was terrified. She sounded small and shaken on the phone. I felt frozen between being vindicated and being accused. My relatives started picking sides. My aunt told me not to let pride ruin the rest of my family. My sister stopped answering my calls. I spent 3 nights straight learning how to read metadata. I pulled the attached will file my father had emailed me, and I inspected the PDF properties. The document metadata showed creation dates and modification times. The version my father had sent was created months before the notarized will. Then I loaded the notarized will into the program, and the metadata told a different story. The file had been scanned and saved on a date 10 days after my father's burial. The scan's metadata had a scanner ID that matched a model used by the small law office that filed the will. I sat in my car outside the law office the next morning until someone opened. I watched a woman leave carrying a small box and a legal pad. She fit the profile of my stepmother, but I couldn't prove anything from across the street. I followed her for 2 blocks until she ducked into a grocery store. That same day, I met a retired postal worker who remembered delivering a box to that lawyer's office the week after my father died. He remembered because the box was heavy and unusual. He told me it was sealed with white tape and labeled in handwriting that matched my stepmother's grocery list. I took that to my attorney. He filed emergency subpoenas demanding logs from the law office, the notary, and the bank. The court ordered them to preserve all relevant records until the hearing. That week, a private investigator I hired found surveillance footage from a strip mall camera outside the law office. The footage showed my stepmother entering the law office 3 times over a week. On one of those visits, the footage showed her carrying a stack of papers and later leaving with a man I did not recognize. The investigator traced the man to a courier service and discovered he was paid a large cash sum 3 days after the will was filed. The courier's log had a signature that didn't match any of the sanctioned employee names. It looked like manufactured paperwork. On the day the hearing arrived, I felt like I had been holding my breath for months. The courtroom smelled like old books. The judge wore a face of patience. My stepmother sat to the left and looked composed. My mother sat behind her and wiped at her eyes every so often. The judge allowed both sides to present their documents. The law office produced a chain of custody showing the notary had witnessed my father's signature in the presence of 2 neighbors. The neighbors testified they had seen my father sign on that date. Then my attorney presented what I had found. He showed the email with the attached will my father had sent me months earlier. He showed the bank records proving the safe deposit box had been cleared by the executor before I knew anything. He played the voicemail threatening me. He showed the security footage and the courier logs. My attorney asked the court to allow a handwriting and ink analysis. He asked for the notary's log to be inspected for forgery. The judge nodded and ordered forensic review. He ordered the law office to produce original documents and electronic files. 2 weeks later, the forensic report arrived. The ink used on the notarized will matched a batch used in the law office printer. The notary stamps had impressions inconsistent with the paper fibers. A specialist concluded parts of the signature on the notarized will had been traced over. The neighbors' affidavits were shaky. One neighbor had poor eyesight and the other couldn't recall the date. But the biggest detail was in the email headers. I had an iCloud backup that contained my father's original message with the attached. The backup metadata showed the attachment existed months before the notarized will was scanned. The court could see the timeline clearly now. Everything collapsed at once when the judge read the report in open court. He found probable cause that the notarized will was not a genuine reflection of my father's final conscious wishes and ordered the new will set aside pending further criminal investigation. My stepmother stood and cried and accused me of destroying the family. She said I had humiliated her and ruined what little dignity she had left. Her voice was small, and she looked older in that light. My relatives texted and called. Some were furious I had taken her to court. Some called to say they were sorry and they wished they'd listened sooner. My sister finally came to my house and sat in my kitchen and said she was proud of me for not being silent. The criminal investigation took months. The district attorney called the law office and the notary in for questioning. They found irregularities in the way the files had been handled. The notary had a record of sloppy logs. The attorney who filed the will had a pattern of late-night signatures on crucial forms. In the end, the prosecutor charged the attorney and the notary with document tampering. My stepmother was named as an accessory in the filing because phone records showed calls between her and the attorney in the days leading up to the will's filing. She claimed she was pressured and had been trying to do right by my father. The court did not accept that defense. When the criminal case ended, the judge restored my father's original will as the valid document and removed my stepmother as executor. The house was legally transferred into my name. I drove to the county recorder's office and watched the deed change hands. Winning the case did not fix everything. My family line had fractures that reopened with every holiday. The house felt quiet in ways that matched empty rooms. My mother had to decide where her loyalties lay. Some family members stopped speaking to me. The community had opinions, and those opinions took their toll. But I slept again. I fixed the creaky floorboard and rehung the picture of my father on the mantel. I called a locksmith and changed the locks properly this time. I hired a local contractor to patch drywall and replace the new brass lock that hadn't needed replacing in the first place. I still received messages from people who said money had ruined the family. They did not know the nights of digging and the voicemail or the photocopied corner of paper like a torn breadcrumb leading me home. They did not know what it felt like to hold an email that proved your father's voice after someone tried to erase it. Months later, I sat at my kitchen table and read the old sticky note my father had put on the cabinet years ago. It still said my name and the words "stay in family" in his scribble. I pressed my thumb to his handwriting and let it steady me. I did not hug my stepmother at the funeral where she claimed she had loved him. She moved away and found a job in another county. We never reconciled. She asked for forgiveness later and I told her I couldn't give it right now. She was living with the consequences of what she had chosen. The house stayed mine. I planted a row of sunflowers along the fence because my father had told me once he liked seeing something bright from the kitchen window. They grew straight and loud the first summer, and kids on the block stopped to take pictures in front of them. When I sold a small parcel of land my father had owned and used the money to make repairs, I donated a portion to the local hospice that had cared for him. It felt right to give back to the people who had held him at the end. I kept the email he had sent and I printed it and framed it. I put the frame on the bookshelf in the living room where I could see it when I walked in. It was a small thing, a sentence in his voice that had refused to disappear. I still called my mother every Sunday. She was healing at her own pace. She told me once that she had been scared and she had picked the wrong side to protect. She said she was learning that protecting someone who betrayed you was not the same as loyalty. I told her I heard her and that I loved her. She said she was proud I'd fought for what was mine. 2 years after the probate mess, I invited a few family members over for dinner. Not everyone came, but the people who did sat around my father's old dining table and we ate and didn't speak about the will. We spoke about my father's garden and his terrible coffee and the time he taught my niece to ride a bike. I still spent nights sometimes, but now they were nights reading in the study or walking the dog at midnight because the house felt safe. I locked the safe deposit box myself and added a copy of the original will inside with a note in my father's handwriting that said, "Thank you for hearing me." I did not get revenge. I got and a judge and a deed. But what I kept was the quiet fact that my father's words mattered. That was what I wanted most. When I started digging in dumpsters and filing subpoenas, I wanted his choice to stand. On a weekday in late summer, I walked out to the porch and sat with a cup of coffee and watched the sun hit the sunflowers. The house was mine and it smelled like the lavender I had planted by the back steps. I still felt the cuts from the fight nagging and raw at times, but I felt steadier. I still kept the list of boundaries I had sent to my family taped inside a kitchen cabinet. Sometimes someone would test them and I'd have to remind myself to be firm, but ground had shifted. I had proof and a home and a mark that said I had fought. The last piece of paper I kept was a photocopy of the torn corner I'd found in the dumpster. I looked at it once a month. It reminded me that I had spent nights finding proof because no one else heard me when I said my father's house belonged to me. It reminded me that I had kept looking until the law listened.